My name is Gia Vasconcelos.
My name is Eleonora Rowe, and this is our performance, Ruling the Night, the awe-inspiring legacy of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Extra!
Russian women aviators set non-stop record.
Russian girl pilots taking off to battle Nazis.
Major Rashkova, heroine of the Soviet Union, widely known.
Russian woman flyer killed on active duty.
State funeral held for Major Rashkova.
Extra!
Extra!
In 1942, Russian woman Marina Raskova formed the all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment, which came to be known as the Night Witches, to fight for the Soviet Union during World War II.
Each woman accepted into this regiment, most in their late teens and 20s, flew about 10 to 12 missions per night, facing extremely dangerous situations to drop bombs, railroad ties, and even Soviet pamphlets on Nazi camps by night.
In doing so, this regiment, with Raskova at their lead, psychologically tortured the Nazis and preserved Russian life in the face of conflict, breaking major barriers of gender capabilities in war and expressing pride in their own femininity.
My name is Marina Rashkova. Born in Moscow, I studied aeronautics at the NYE Zhukovsky Air Force as a young woman. I worked until finally, in 1934, I became one of the first women in the Soviet Union to achieve a pilot's license, breaking a barrier in the country's views on women's capabilities.
My name is Eva Pavlov. I've always been so inspired by the stories of Marina Raskova, particularly when, in 1938, Raskova and two other women set a record for the shortest non-stop direct flight over Russia.
My team of women was highly celebrated and referred to as the Winged Sisters. It was at this point that I broke down a major barrier on female representation and publicity, obtaining my great fame and popularity with the general public, especially young girls.
These stories are so incredible, but something in me knew that these new ideals were still only a facade. My mother was regularly mistreated in the workplace, even though she worked just as hard as any man and was still expected to care for my little sister.
But then, disaster struck.
It was during this time that Nazi Germany emerged as a strong political power, attempting to invade many Western European countries. Russia had fortified its defenses, seizing territory to form the Soviet Union. But war was stirring.
On June 22nd, 1941, the Soviet capital Leningrad was taken under siege, and Nazi Germany declared war on the Soviet Union. This fateful event would be known by its German name, Operation Barbarossa. Later that year, Russia entered in an alliance of three major world powers. The largest country in the world, my country, was plunged into chaos.
After my father died fighting against the Nazis in July 1941, I knew I had to do something. But despite the new freedoms that the Soviet regime had supposedly granted working women, females were still barred from fighting in the war.
I had to do something too. Operation Barbarossa had destroyed over 21,000 of the Red Army's planes. Someone needed to create a united front, a force that no one expected. I petitioned to Stalin to create 3 all-female airspace regiments.
This created opportunities for women across the nation, including me.
There were over 2,000 applicants for these positions, but Stalin's new regiments needed to be made up of strong, hard-working fighters, so only 400 elite women, some as young as 17, were accepted into each of the 3 regiments. We took the girls to Ingalls School of Aviation to train.
Each of us new recruits had to learn in a mere few months how to become self-sufficient military pilots, a program that would normally take 2 years.
Sadly, these regiments I created were met with fierce opposition from male Air Force pilots, who believed that women simply weren't as capable as they were.
One male general even complained to us that he was being sent a bunch of girlies instead of real soldiers. But we were determined, even as my friends and fellow fighters faced emotional and sexual harassment from the male soldiers.
For the girls, this was no longer just about winning the war. It became a fight to prove that they could do anything that men could, and better.
We trained harder, ran faster, and stood stronger. They could not take our spirits.
Though each of these regiments was incredibly important and represented women breaking the barriers of sexism in war, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, or the Night Witches as they were called by German soldiers, came to be the most influential.
We were fearless to a fault. Our planes couldn't carry parachutes, guns, radar, or radios due to limited military funds and weight limits, but instead, everyone compensated with what they had.
We made sure that our fighters weren't afraid to be female. In our spare time, the girls decorated their planes with flowers, danced, and sang, but it was far from paradise.
The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's planes, Polikarpov PO-2s, were so run down that they were often referred to as sewing machines.
In fact, former Night Witch Nadia Popova even later recalled, "It's a wonder we didn't lose more aircraft. Our planes were the slowest in the force. They often came back riddled with bullets, but they kept flying."
It was on June 28th of 1942 that the 588th Regiment had its first mission.
With myself at the lead, a small team of bombers was taken to the edge of the border where Operation Barbarossa had taken place. Our battle was brief, but effective.
This first attack lessened some doubts of our capabilities. It may not have erased all of our problems, but it was certainly a start. We, as a regiment, had broken our first barrier, defying the limitations that society forced upon us.
From then on, between 8 and 18 runs were executed per woman each night.
Each plane held 2 women, a pilot and a navigator, who worked together to drop bombs on the sleeping Nazi camps.
This method was used as psychological torture to ensure that the Nazi camps wouldn't be able to fight as well come morning. But exposed cockpits, freezing temperatures, and disorienting snowstorms were just the beginning for us.
For it was on our missions that we faced our greatest peril.
All right, Night 35, mission number...
What was that?
German anti-aircraft guns! They must have guessed our ambush schedule and known we'd be here this time of night. Ava, we have to complete this mission.
Is the engine idle?
Affirmative. We don't have much time. Are you ready?
During my time in the 588th Regiment, our classic move was to set the engine of our planes in idle and glide silently over Nazi camps, dropping bombs, railroad ties, or even Soviet pamphlets upon the sleeping soldiers. The pilot would then reach forward and manually crank the engine back into ignition, and the team would, hopefully, fly away unscathed.
That was one of the wildest escapes of my life. But I think that mission taught us all a lesson, that even though we were undertrained and less physically strong than our male counterparts, with determination, women could do anything that they set their minds to.
The 2 of us were able to survive this attack, but we would not always be so lucky, and neither would our fellow soldiers. But the hardest hit for the 3 Russian war regiments came on January 9th of 1943, when the death of Marina Raskova, accomplished pilot in many rights, was announced to the public. She had been shot down in an air raid against the Nazis. All of us were devastated by our leader's death.
Men also suffered great losses. 80% of the Russian men born in 1923 were dead by the end of World War II. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was disbanded 6 months after the war ended, flying 30,000 total missions and dropping 23,000 tons of bombs on German camps. Each woman in the force flew about 800 missions, and yet the pilots were not allowed in the Moscow Victory Parade at the end of the war, due to claims that their planes were just too slow.
I felt like I was being stripped from part of my identity. How could we break so many barriers and yet still be discredited because we were women? I refused to pretend like my time in the 588th Night Bomber Regiment never happened. Instead, it made me who I am today.
However, these 3 brave regiments did not go unnoticed, and women across the world were inspired by the female-inclusive environment fostered by Marina's regiments. Perhaps most notably, Major Mary T. Rossi, the first American female aviator to fly in a combat mission.
And these weren't the only examples of women breaking barriers at the time. Madame Versailles, Jeannie Rousseau, Virginia Hall, and Eloise Page were busy across the globe, breaking major barriers in communications and gender roles in France and America during World War II.
In Russia, these 3 regiments were able to break the initial barriers of society's gendered stereotypes and pave the way for over 100,000 women in Russia's armed forces today.
Russia became a leading force in putting women in air and space. Valentina Tereshkova, a Russian aviator, became the first woman in space in 1963.
Let us not be the footnotes of history.
Let us not be forgotten or swept into the dust.
Our stories are important.
Our stories are so needed.
And the legacy of the Night Witches will live on.